back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. On Science Fantastic, we profile the amazing, jaw-dropping scientific discoveries that are revolutionizing our world and touching our lives. And in this hour, we're going to bring back Dr. Nathan Lenz, author of a great book that I highly recommend. It's called Human Errors, a panorama of our glitches, from the pointless bones to broken genes. Now, when we think of the human body, we sometimes have this image of perfection. I mean, we have ballet and acrobatics and all sorts of Olympic sports to glamorize the human body. But how good is the human body anyway, as seen from an engineering and strictly practical point of view? Well, with us today is Dr. Nathan Lenz, professor of biology at John Jay College, a division of the City University of New York, and his new book is called Human Errors, a panorama of our glitches from pointless bones to broken genes. Well, Nathan, glad you could be on Science Fantastic once again.
Thanks so much for the invitation. I enjoy it.
Well, once again, when you were a child, think back when you were a kid. What steered you in the direction of science and then eventually biology?
Well, I've always had a curiosity about how things work. I was the kind of kid who took machines apart. I took electronics apart. I had a chemistry set. I was always tinkering and wondering, and I think that the one thing that all scientists and all disciplines have in common is that curiosity, that insatiable sense of, no, but how does it work? And if someone would give me a one-sentence explanation, and I'd always have more questions and more questions and more questions until it got down to almost first principles. So I think that the curiosity is really what drives me. And then you asked how I got into biology. Well, as I was going through high school and college, I enjoyed chemistry and I enjoyed physics, but it was really biology that I thought was the ultimate mystery, because the driving question in my research now is how we got this way as human beings. What makes us tick? What makes us different than other animals? And so that seems to me like the grandest question of all. But I'm sure all scientists think that about their work.
Okay, well, talking about human origins, let's talk about the recent debate that you've gotten into concerning, well, Adam and Eve. There are at least two ways of looking at Adam and Eve. One way is through the Bible, that God created Adam and then created Eve. The other way is through genetics, by saying that, well, we actually descended from an ape-like creature, and that the separation took place around 6 million years ago, and there's no one Adam or Eve. But there's also new genetic information showing that about 100,000 years ago, a handful of humans gave birth to the entire human race. In which case, in some sense, there was a genetic Eve and a genetic Adam that existed in a tribe that eventually gave birth to the entire human race. Now, on this spectrum, where do you fit?
Well, I'm a scientist, and I follow the scientific data pretty strictly. I think you're absolutely right that the overwhelming evidence argues for a naturalistic origin of humanity. We are descended from ape-like ancestors. We share common ancestry with every living thing on this planet going back 4 billion years. There's really no real doubt about that. And in fact, as you said, the origins of our species are between 100 and 200,000 years ago in Africa. And there is such a thing as a mitochondrial Eve, from which we're all descended, or from whom we're all descended, and a Y chromosome Adam, from whom we're all descended. But they lived in different places and at different times. And we had many other ancestors, not just them. And so I think science has very solidly disproven the idea that the entire race came from just two people. There's just simply no way that could work out based on what we know of population genetics. However, a new idea, well, it's actually an old idea, but we've gotten new support, is that for Christians, and actually some Jews and Muslims as well, they really need to believe in Adam and Eve as ancestors of all of us in order to keep their faith. And so when their faith conflicts with science, a lot of times they just simply ditch the science and they stick with their faith. Well, this new idea that's come about is that you could have a special creation of Adam and Eve, and in the world, and the world being just as we see it now, and the human race having descended from our ancestry, as we know, and then they bred into that population. So a special Adam and Eve, maybe 10,000 years ago, were created, and then their offspring bred into the regular population. And then through what we now know is called universal ancestry, they very well could have become one of our many universal ancestors. So their offspring continue to spread all around the world and breed into all the populations around the world, to the sense that we all have, among our many billions of ancestors, this special couple. Now, just to be clear, I don't believe in Adam and Eve at all. I'm an atheist. I have no reason to believe in any of that. But some people do, and they take that belief very seriously. So I've come out in support of this idea that science doesn't disprove the possibility of a special creation for Adam and Eve, as long as they maintain that they bred into the regular population, because we know from the genetics that was never just two people. That's impossible. But there's many ancestors that leave no trace in our genomes. We call those genealogical ancestors, not genetic ancestors. So to really understand this hypothesis, you have to separate genetic ancestry from genealogical ancestry. And there's nothing saying that Adam and Eve couldn't have been our genealogical ancestors. And that's really all that the claim is. And if it brings more Christians on board with evolutionary science, I'm all for it.
So let's back up a bit. You're saying that on one hand, we have the grand sweep of our family tree going all the way back to the ape-like creatures in Africa. That's one branch. But you're saying that maybe, 10,000 years ago, that there was a special couple, an Adam and Eve, that bred into this long stream that then created the human race? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm not saying that happened. I'm saying that science couldn't disprove it. And that the human race existed before that couple. We definitely know that, and they had spread to most corners of the earth by that point. But it's also possible that they could have bred into that population, and then their ancestry spread through the population that already existed. And that would be sort of what I say is that moves this miracle, as we would call it, into the column of miracles that science can't really prove or disprove. And that's why I'm okay with this, because it's not bending science to religion. It's sort of rewriting a religious interpretation so that it's compatible with science. And so, in that regard, I'm all for it.
Okay.
Because it doesn't force people to choose one or the other. Because a lot of people have chosen their religion over science. So if they revise their understanding of the Book of Genesis so that it's compatible with science, then that's great. You have a resolution to that conflict. And I'm tired of the conflict, of the fighting over science, when science offers us so much. And we need science to get us through all the problems that we face right now. I'd rather not be fighting people about science.
Okay. Well, let's talk about your book now. Your book is called Human Errors, a panorama of our glitches from pointless bones to broken genes. We've had you on before to begin a discussion of your book, but there's so many things in your book. Let me ask you the following question. We've had people on Science Fantastic who build robots. And if you were to build a robot from scratch, I mean, forget the Terminator, forget Arnold Schwarzenegger. If you were to design a robot from scratch, the first thing that you would throw out is the back. The back gets thrown out when you're about 40 years of age. What a horrible design flaw. And after the break, we'll talk to you about whether or not our body is really designed optimally. Once again, you are listening to Science Fantastic. Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Once again, our special guest today is Professor Nathan Lenz, Professor of Biology at John Jay College of the City University of New York. And we're talking about his delightful book, Human Errors, a panorama of our glitches from pointless bones to broken genes. Well, as I mentioned, we've had roboticists on Science Fantastic who try to design robots from scratch. Rather than having them have humanoid form, have them have the most efficient form. And they say that our swayback, which seems so elegant when we watch the ballet operas and look at dance shows, the swayback is a horrible way to design a robot. I mean, a long time ago, we used to walk on our knuckles. And walking on our knuckles, our backbone arched forward. But one day, we don't know how, but one day we stood upright, wrenching our back into an S. into this horrible sway back, freeing up our hands, accelerating our evolution as humans, but at a tremendous cost of ruining our back. And if you hit the age of 40, you'll realize that, yes, your back goes out when you hit around the age of 40. So if you were to design a robot, would you design a robot with a back like ours? And what other kinds of things would you change?
Yeah, well, our S-shaped backbone certainly is a problem because it creates points of weakness. If it were much more straight or vertical, the weight would be distributed more appropriately. But with these sharp curves, especially in the lower region, the lumbar part of the back, we've inserted a couple of extra vertebrae compared to our ancestors, but it still has this nice sharp curve, and that's really the point of weakness. It's usually the lower back that gives you the problem. And what happens is when you have a curved vertebral column, the little discs of cartilage in between, they're designed to absorb the shock and to lubricate those joints. They get squeezed out. You can imagine it's a curved one, so you have it's squeezed more tightly on one side than the other, so it pushes it out in that direction, and that's called a slip disc or a herniated disc. And no other apes deal with this. Herniated discs are very common in the human condition, but we never see gorillas or chimpanzees with slip discs because their backs have a much more gentle sloping to them. It's kind of a gentle J or C-shaped slope to them, whereas ours has this sharp curve that really creates the problem. But there's a number of problems with our back, as well as our knees and our ankles. I always say we are only partially adapted to upright walking. We never fully completed the transition. And part of the problem was that the transition was made in the evolutionary blink of an eye. It was really quick when we went from walking on all fours to walking upright. And anything you do quickly, you don't do well. You don't do it thoroughly. And so I think if that had been a more gradual transition, I think natural selection could have shaped our joints much better. But instead, we have this very weak ACL. The ACL is the ligament that holds the upper leg and the lower leg together. It does the lion's share of the work. And there's no way to make it stronger. It's a ligament, not a muscle. So our bodies just are too big for this tiny little ligament. And what happens is when you turn suddenly, you put enormous strain on the ACL, and it breaks and it tears, and it really requires surgical repair. So all the ACL injuries that you see in sports, that's really a function of two things. Number one, our bodies are getting much bigger, but number two, that ligament is just not up to the task. Evolution didn't make it didn't bulk it up the way it should have when we transitioned from 4 legs to just 2.
And also, going back even further into our evolutionary past, isn't it true that, well, we have tailbones, and doesn't that mean that once upon a time we had tails, and that in hospitals, every once in a while, a baby is born with a short tail, and of course they have to cut the tail off or else it'll freak out the mother. But isn't it true that that's a remnant of our evolution?
Yeah, that's right. Our tailbone itself is a vestigial structure. You have either 3, 4, or 5 extra vertebrae at the end that you really don't need. And the way that we know you don't need them is if you were to cut off the tailbone, it's called the coccyx. So if you had a coccygectomy, there are no side effects. You don't have any problems sitting or standing or laying. You don't have any problems with continence or bowel control. It really doesn't do anything. And it's an extra structure. And the reason why some people have them removed is that just like any other tissue in your body, it can get cancer. So one thing I say is the only thing the tailbone does for you is occasionally get cancer. Not commonly, but if it does, obviously that would be a flaw for those individuals. But the most interesting thing about the tailbone is that most of us, not even all of us, but most of us have a muscle attached to it called the pyramidalis muscle. And this muscle would be able to flex our tail and move it around if we had one. So I often say we don't have a tail, but if we did, we do have the muscle that could move it around. And that's just an example of how evolution never really completed the regression of the tail either. Our fellow apes don't have tails either. Most monkeys do. But it regressed and regressed and regressed through mutation. And the birth defect that you mentioned where sometimes a baby is born with a partial tail, what you're seeing there is what's called a spontaneous revertant, where you revert a previous mutation to its previous form, and then it sort of unmasks some of what evolution has already dealt with. And you see this sometimes where dolphins are born with little tiny hind fins. Sometimes even snakes, you can see the remnants of a pelvis, even though they don't have any limbs to attach to it. So the echoes of our past can sometimes be seen in our bodies, especially when you have revertants or mutations like this. You can see some of the phases that we went through in evolution to get to the form that we're in. But evolution is sloppy. It's aimless. It is not goal-oriented. It doesn't move in a particular direction. It just sort of trims us to be the best we can with the bodies that we have and the environments that we live in. And when those environments change, we struggle to keep up. And so none of us are perfectly adapted. We'll never be perfectly adapted. You mentioned some of the glorious feats of human, the human physical form, but those are extreme. We think of the beautiful athletes and ballet dancers, but how many years of training and of rigor does it take to get to that extreme form? Most of us don't have bodies anything like that. And in fact, there are way more people with torn ACLs than people who can do, a backflip. So I would say that the extremes of human performance really aren't a good yardstick to measure human perfection.
And also, though we have a lot of vestigial organs that we don't really need, like the appendix, we really don't need an appendix anymore. In fact, if it gets inflamed, it could actually kill you, right? Right.
That's correct. And the appendix is an interesting story because we do know that if you remove the appendix, some people have increased chance of getting a certain type of colitis. So it might actually be functioning as a reservoir of good bacteria. And so some people have said, no, it's not vestigial, it's important. But I would argue it's still, in a sense, a flaw because, yes, it might harbor some good bacteria, but when it gets inflamed, it kills you. So it's hard not to see it as a flaw if you get appendicitis. So whether you have colitis or not, if you have appendicitis, it's a lethal condition. I mean, you need surgery immediately or you'll die. So, and surgery was only invented about 140 years ago, and that surgery in particular is probably less than 100 years ago. So I would say that it was definitely a flaw, and if you've ever had appendicitis, it's hard to see it as anything other than a flaw.
And also, if you think about evolution, right, evolutionary pressure only takes place during the years when you can have a baby. That is, from, let's say, up to 25 years of age, let's say. And after that, evolution doesn't care. Because you got the child can then fend for itself. And so doesn't that mean that certain diseases of old people are diseases that evolution never neglected to solve, like Parkinson's, the diseases of the brain, even aging, Alzheimer's? These are diseases of old people, right? Cancer. But aren't they diseases that evolution never bothered to finish because after 25 you don't have kids anymore?
Yes, to a certain extent that's true, that evolution has a great big blind spot when we get to more advanced age, in the sense that death and survival just don't seem to impact the future of the species very much. But I would put a slight condition on that in the sense that our social structure is so intricate and our older generation is so involved in the lives of the younger generation that actually there is some natural selection does act on an older age, at least with our social structure, in the sense that young children are better off when their grandparents are around and helping them. So we happen to benefit from a little bit of natural selection in older age, much more than most species do, because of the value that older people have in the success of younger people. But that's a fairly recent trick. And menopause, actually, one theory about menopause is that it actually nudges older women to be more involved in their grandchildren's life rather than just creating more children themselves. So that might be a chance of an example of natural selection really acting later in life.
Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Once again, our special guest is, Dr. Nathan Lentz, Professor of Biology at John Jay College, a division of the City University of New York, and the book is called Human Errors, a panorama of our glitches from pointless bones to broken genes. Well, we were talking about the aging process, and one of the bad things about aging is arthritis. And there's a theory that says that we get arthritis because our immune system is hyperactive and begins to attack itself. Now, if you think about it, you can't think of anything more stupid than a defense system which decides to attack itself. But this overactive immune system, isn't that in some sense a quote-unquote mistake of evolution, that it went too far?
Yeah, so the immune system is a great example of how evolution and natural selection really works with a body in its proper environment or its natural environment. And so, yes, arthritis does seem to be an overactive immune system. And there's other diseases that are the result of this. One that I think is the craziest of all is lupus, because lupus is the immune system attacking itself. The immune system is the very system that's doing the attacking is also the victim. And when you fight yourself, there cannot be a winner. So how does this happen? Well, one very dominant theory now in understanding the evolution of the immune system was that in our past, we lived in a sort of dirtier world in terms of germs, but most of those germs were not pathogenic. They were not harmful. But our immune system, like the rest of our body, evolved in a world where it was much more active. Right, so we didn't sterilize our lives. We didn't wash our hands all the time. We didn't cook our food until fairly recently. But we were just exposed to a lot more of healthy, safe germs, and our immune system got very, very good at sorting out the good germs and the bad germs because it had a lot of practice. The immune system, like everything else, gets better with practice. And so when we deny ourselves the exposure of all of these safe germs, especially in childhood, our immune system never really gets the training that it needs. And so we think we're doing the right thing by raising our children in a totally clean environment and scrubbing all their clothes and sterilizing their bottles, but we're actually harming them because what we're doing is we're denying the immune system exposure to safe germs that will help it practice, that will help it learn friend from foe. And when you don't know who's a friend and who's a foe, at least if you're not that good at it, you will accidentally attack your friends. And that's exactly what happens with our immune system, with allergies, with autoimmune diseases, like you mentioned, arthritis, lupus. There's all kinds of autoimmune diseases that seem to be at least partially the result of the fact that we are not using our immune system in the way that it was designed to work, which is in a dirty world.
Now, there's an expression, seeing is believing, but let's talk about the brain and perception. Isn't it true that the brain takes shortcuts? That is, what you see is not really reality. It's a shortcut version of reality. For example, your optic nerve and your retina, by rights, your optic nerve should obscure part of your vision because that's where the nerves connect to the brain. But you don't see anything. You think you see a smooth reality, which is an optical illusion because the body patches in the spot where the optic nerve is. So instead of seeing a big, gigantic black spot in the middle of your vision, you see pure nothing. So what are your thoughts about whether or not the brain sometimes takes a lot of shortcuts to create a very fast representation of reality when reality is much more complicated?
Yeah, I think you said it perfectly. Our brain has evolved to do very quick calculations, to establish rules and then follow those rules rather than simply taking in the world around us as it is.
Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Once again, our special guest today is Professor Nathan Lentz, Professor of Biology at John Jay College of the City University of New York. And when we last left off, we were talking about the fact that what you see is not what you get. That you only approximate reality rapidly because you have to see that tiger hiding in the forest. You have to see that lion that's just about to pounce on you, and you have to jump to conclusions sometimes. So isn't it true that sometimes we see things that aren't really there, and that the brain forces us to see, for example, images in clouds? Clouds, of course, are formless. They mean nothing. But you see images, you see faces, you see people, you see cartoon characters in clouds because your brain thinks that that's a good way to survive because one of these days it's going to save your butt. So what are your thoughts about the imperfections now of the brain?
Right. So it's funny to call it an imperfection because really what it's doing is the brain making incredible leaps and filling in all kinds of blanks, but it doesn't always get it right. And when the brain pieces together all of the input that we're bombarded with, especially visual input, we're just bombarded with all of these images that come in, of course, as electromagnetic radiation, and we have to make sense of it, and we have to make sense of it quickly, as you said, because a split second second can be the difference in life and death. So we generate rules and we look for patterns. And those rules are called heuristics, and the brain sort of measures the input against its memories, and then it makes a call. So when you look at a chair, for example, your brain very quickly matches up that input with the stored images that you have in the association areas, so that you can just glance at it and immediately know what it is. And that's great for making quick judgments, but it also leaves you vulnerable to being fooled. And so the whole world of optical illusions and stage magic and other things like this are based on the idea that our brains will leap to conclusions very, very quickly based on limited input and fill in the blanks. The other thing that our brain does, and this is even larger than vision, it really affects everything we do and everything we think about, is pattern recognition. We are always looking for patterns, and we will see patterns even when they aren't there because it's so overactive. And that's why you mentioned we'll see a face in the cloud, or we'll see, especially faces, by the way, because it is really how we interact with each other is by looking at faces. So we'll see faces anywhere. You'll see faces of Jesus in your toast in the morning if you look for it. And so this tendency to overread the data in order to find a pattern really goes all the way back to the earliest evolution of our brain. And again, it wasn't a flaw probably when we were living in the savannah of Africa. It probably saved our lives and helped us figure out, well, even in this sense, if you can recognize how the flock moves, then you can see that pattern, then you can predict it and you can catch them. So it really was quite valuable, but our tendency to overinterpret the data leads us to make a lot of mistakes and to see patterns that really aren't there. So that's why it's now a flaw, even though it might not have been in the past.
In fact, I understand there's a word for it called pareidolia. Pareidolia is seeing things that are not really there, because in the long run, maybe it'll one day save your butt.
That's right.
Okay.
So we have an extreme sensitivity to creepy crawlies because, like you said, it saved our lives.
Okay, well, in your book you had a number of very interesting anomalies of the human body. What are some of your favorites? That is, if you were to have a handful of them to show to young students the quirkiness of the human body, what illustrations would you choose?
Honestly, I think the poor design of our sinus cavities is one of my favorite ones, because our sinus cavities, everyone sort of thinks of them as, oh, they warm up the air, they help us purify the air before we breathe it. That's actually not true at all. In fact, if you breathe through your mouth instead of your nose, you skip those sinus cavities altogether, and there's no downside to that. You can breathe through your mouth and be just fine.
Okay, let's take another short commercial break. Once again, you are listening to Science Fantastic. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Once again, our special guest today is Professor Nathan Lenz. And so I asked you a question. If you were to jot down a handful of your favorite glitches, glitches that are kind of humorous but summarize your basic point, what would they be?
Yeah, so I think the sinus cavities are especially poorly designed. We don't really need them at all. But what's worse about that is they're constantly creating mucus, which is fine, and it sort of drains down into our throat, and then we swallow it. But the problem is the drainage pipe of our largest sinus cavities, these are the maxillary sinus cavities in our cheeks, the drain pipe for those cavities is located at the top of the chamber, not the bottom, where you would expect, where a plumber would put the drain at the bottom. So this is definitely not intelligently designed. And what that means is that your body has to work very hard to push the mucus up to the drain so that it can drain. And when that doesn't happen, when it gets full of dust or particles, the mucus pools at the bottom of that cavity, and that's how you get the common cold, that's how you get sinus infections, and that really turns that mucus into a thick, festering pool of infection. And it really comes down to design, because if you look at the sinus cavities of other apes, of any other mammals, they flow much better. They have a better design. The drain pipe isn't at the top of the chamber, and because of that, they don't get the common cold. And if you were to, a lot of us have dogs and cats, and they don't, come down with sniffles and sneezes 3 or 4 times a year. This is really a uniquely human condition, the common cold, and it has to do at least partly with the poor design of our sinuses. So that's always at the top of my list, just because we get colds so commonly. Another one, if you have time for another example.
Sure.
Is how needy our diet is. We really need a little bit of this, a little bit of that. We're actually very poor at extracting nutrients from our food, and even worse at making those nutrients ourselves, like most animals do. And the reason our diet is so needy is that for most of our evolutionary history, we were living in a salad bowl of really rich, nutritious food. We were generalists. We were omnivores. We ate lots of different things. We ate worms and bone marrow and meat and vegetables. We had access to so much rich food that our bodies got lazy in making a lot of these things ourselves. And so now, what sounds like a good thing is being able to eat anything has become a real Achilles heel, in the sense that we have to have a rich diet in order to be healthy. And so you need fruits and you need vegetables and you need a little bit of this, a little bit of that, or else you're not healthy. Whereas most animals can survive on a very, very simple diet. If you look at the koala, it eats eucalyptus leaves pretty much exclusively, and they can be completely healthy on just that one type of leaf, where there is not one food you can eat and be healthy. In fact, you need lots of different kinds of foods to get everything that we need, and that's a flaw in and of itself.
Okay, here is an abstract question. Has evolution stopped? I mean, of course, people still have selection as to who they marry and have kids with, but in the main, when you look at the larger picture, are we getting bigger brains? Are we getting better fingers so we can manipulate our cell phones? What are your thoughts about whether or not evolution has pretty much stopped or whether it's continuing?
Right. So evolution has definitely not stopped for the reasons that you just mentioned. So we're deciding who we have kids with, or whether or not we're having kids. But natural selection has mostly stopped. So natural selection, really, who lives and dies, almost everyone that's born lives to reproductive age. So we're really not under the watchful eye of natural selection anymore. But we are evolving in the sense of who reproduces and how much. And our brains are not getting bigger, that's for sure. In fact, our brains are getting smaller over the last 100,000 years. Actually, our brains have gotten a little bit smaller over the last 500,000 years, but that's probably because they've gotten more efficient. Brains are extremely energy expensive, and so there's been a lot of pressure on our species to use our brain more efficiently. So we have 10% smaller brains than Neanderthals, for example. Most people don't realize that. But I don't think they were smarter than us. We have more efficient brains. Our hands aren't getting any better. In fact, I would say our bodies are getting worse, if anything, simply because people who have various defects and deficiencies in their bodies, it really doesn't cost them any reproductive success anymore. We fix those flaws with modern medicine. So in a sense, genetically speaking, we're probably getting worse, but we're getting better in terms of the output, the final function, because we're augmenting our bodies with technology, and that was only going to continue. And that's part of our evolution as well, if you think about it. So we're not separate from these fixes. Those fixes are part of who we are, and that's how we will continue to evolve. So I'm very optimistic about our future.
Well, my favorite mistake in evolution would be snoring. Very few apes snore. We snore because our snout has been being compressed into our face. Bulldogs will snore because their snout is also quite close to their nasal cavities. But most dogs don't snore. Most animals don't snore because it's a dead giveaway to predators and your enemies. But we do snore because our snout has been pushed into our face, compressing everything back there in our nasal cavities. So, well, what are your thoughts? I mean, do you think that snoring is really an accident of evolution?
Yeah, in fact, I think you said it very well. In the evolution of primates and then monkeys and then especially humans, we smushed our snout up into our face so that we could bring our eyes forward and get this 3D vision. So you need your eyes to cover both eyes to cover your field of vision in order to see in 3 dimensions very well. And the cost of that, of course, was the snout moved up in our face. But that's one half of it. The other half of it is that most people who snore are at least slightly overweight. And what happens when you're overweight in the laying down position is that the septum that separates our nasopharynx from our regular pharynx can flop down. So I think and we become overweight because of evolution as well. So I think that both of those things together, the poor design of the nasal cavities and the poor design that's leading to obesity, they sort of collide onto our throats, and that's why we snore so much.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, that's the time we have for Science Fantastic. Once again, our special guest has been Dr. Nathan Lenz, Professor of Biology at John Jay College of the City University of New York. And his book, a delightful book, I highly recommend it, is Human Errors, a panorama of our glitches from pointless bones to broken genes.